Welcome to Time for Hope, a faith-based mental health program. Join our host, certified clinical mental health counselor and Christian psychotherapist Dr. Freda Crews, and her guests as they discuss real-life issues and offer expert clinical advice and solid biblical application for any and all life situations. Now, here's the host of Time for Hope, Dr. Freda Crews.
Thanks for joining me for our second week and concluding week on the subject of a realistic view of marriage. And I left off with the idea that there are no perfect marriages. Instead, conflict will become inevitable between two people. Two people bring into a marriage two different backgrounds, two different familial backgrounds, two different experiences in life, bring all kinds of things into a marriage that can cause conflict. And sometimes in a marriage, each wants to have their way and do it their way and have and do their thing, as it were, and be self-centered, as we've already referred to. So conflict will be inevitable in a marriage, keeping it from ever being perfect. But it also doesn't have to be all bad. All conflict does not have to be bad. Some conflict, if it's handled appropriately with appropriate communication, can actually help a marriage as a couple, as it were, make their way through the rapids in a marriage and learn how to handle those rapids as they go through them. I've left you from the garden now and I have you on a creek or a river that has rapids, and we could think of that even in a marriage, that it's inevitable, conflict is, but it doesn't have to be all bad. Instead, some conflict is necessary for us to grow and develop individually, and to grow and develop within our marriage. So we actually, if our needs or our communication present conflict, then it's time to look at that conflict and try to handle it in an appropriate way. And then we move on to the whole thought and idea that change in a marriage is also inevitable. As conflict is inevitable, change is inevitable. I had someone tell me one time that their marriage broke up because change took place, that two people change. And two people will change as they grow older, as they stay longer in a marriage. But they can change individually and personally, and this should be encouraged if it's positive change, not if it's negative change, but if it's positive change that our mate is undergoing and seeking and so forth, then we should encourage the changes that are taking place, and that should be within our learning to communicate with each other, as it were. So we can allow for the other person to change. Each of us allow for the other person to change and grow, but not grow apart in the process. That see to it that we grow together in the process within the marriage. And then another thought that I want to leave with you when this series is finished is that marriage can be viewed as a crucible. You said, oh man, I don't like that word. That means that I'm going to be worked on, and that I'm going to be giving, and that I'm going to be being made different, and so on and so forth. And yes, it does mean that. And yes, God intends for us to have crucibles, as it were, in our life to conform us into the image of Jesus Christ. And a marriage can help conform us into the image of Christ as we learn to listen, as we learn to communicate, as we learn to give, as we learn to forgive, as we think about letting our anger go. Anger, of course, is one of those foxes that can spoil the vine of marriage. And as we think of any bitterness that might have built up, going before the Lord with it, and getting rid of that bitterness, getting rid of the anger, getting rid of the negative things in our life, and focus on becoming conformed into the image of Jesus Christ and allowing the conflict and the changes and so on and so forth within our marriage to help do that and actually become a crucible, as it were, in conforming us to Jesus Christ. And then another thought, and that is that sometimes divorce is inevitable. Again, we get loads of prayer requests into Time for Hope. Many of them involve marriages. Some have already chosen to divorce and are lonely, looking for a new mate and wanting one that God will send them. And then others are staying within a marriage where the partner is having affairs, or, as we read last week, going on drugs. There can be the affairs that greatly interfere in a marriage. And for one to be forgiven of that, there must be a show of genuine repentance brought on by the Lord Himself, and a desire to leave that sin and to be forgiven by God first and by the mate secondly. So sometimes, though, the ones that are doing all that they shouldn't do within a marriage, such as physical abuse, I would never advise someone to stay in a physically abusive marriage. You can separate. I have advised that many times to see if counseling and people can help you or help the abuser work out of the abuse, but don't ever stay in a marriage where you are physically abused. And I've even as I've mentioned, the verbal abuse can be very harmful and hurtful in a marriage also. So those things have to be looked after. If the offending mate refuses to repent, if the offending mate refuses to change, then sometimes with addictions and with physical, mental, and verbal abuse, divorce can become inevitable. Even being deserted by a mate is actually covered in the scriptures as a reason to get out of a marriage. So when we think of divorce, I know at one time it was thought of as the unpardonable sin, and if you divorced it would never be forgiven, and of course that's not true. And sometimes it becomes inevitable in a marriage, So you want to keep that in mind if you're in one of these kinds of situations that I have named that can produce a divorce. Then there is the passage in Ephesians 5 25 through 28. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And this is where the submission comes in. Sometimes a woman stays because she believes being submitted to her husband is absolutely necessary, and she will stay in an abusive marriage. But instead, you ought to read the rest of that chapter and find how husbands are to love their wives and not give the wife reason for divorce. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. And when a man is willing to do that, when a husband is willing to do that, there will be no reason for divorce. They're telling me it's time for a break, and I'll be right back.
The next process is really where you called it yesterday, the big C in communicating. And so Tammy and I will have a range of discussion from our children, our family, to our finances, to our social life. And we also bring up things that may irritate each other a little bit, you know, like I'm not the perfect husband all the time, and maybe
we need to put that out.
Yeah,
We're not talking about a perfect marriage.
No, this is not. Yeah, sometimes
there are no such things.
Sometimes
the touchy stuff.
Yeah.
We sometimes, you know, are one of the kids
you're
like.
very normal.
That's
right.
There's no pretense there. But we do communicate, and it's really amazing how after you've gone through this process of Thanksgiving and counting your blessings and studying the Word, that when you're talking about issues that can maybe bring a little fire, that it's easier to get through.
When does prayer come in?
The prayer.
That's next. That's the next thing we do.
Yeah. The way we conclude our time, and for folks to know, we've done this in truncated small versions, and then we've had other versions that are long. So what we will do is that we'll conclude and we will pray to God to bless us. And you know, we get on our knees, I hold her hand, and I pray first, then I squeeze her hand, and then she says a prayer, and then we get up. And it's a great way to start a day. And that's the biggest thing, and it changes our life day by day, and we've been able to see that.
I am prone to believe that few couples realize the significant role their first few weeks, months, and years of marriage holds in a long-term marriage. Habits are formed early on that will continue, whether good or bad. Intentionality should be the high water goal in all new marriages. Couples must not only guard against negative behaviors, but knowing what positive behaviors will strengthen and build a healthy marriage is vitally necessary. Strong and lasting marriages don't just happen. My friend and colleague, marriage and family therapist H. Norman Wright, writes that marriages often fail because of such misconceptions. Mr. Wright asserts, some marriages dissolve because the partners were never prepared for marriage and because their expectations about marriage were totally unrealistic. Related to Norm's advice to newlyweds, a focus on the family editor relates, when a newly married couple encounters stress or change in their relationship, their commitment can either crumble or become stronger than ever. Tension in the initial months of marriage can stem from an unrealistic approach to one of life's most difficult transitions. Newlyweds need insight to work through various expectations and meet each other's needs effectively. So, it appears that we can conclude that most couples are going to encounter differences, conflict, and disappointment early on in their marriages. The first roadblock to living happily ever after that will be encountered is shattered expectations. Our spouses aren't perfect, cannot read our minds related to our needs, and cannot heal all of our wounds from past hurts. Then, one or both spouses can be self-centered and selfish, and this can do great harm to a marriage. And without a doubt, learning to communicate openly and honestly regarding the other's disturbing behaviors is vitally necessary to sustain a successful marriage. But effective communication does not come naturally. Instead, it must be cultivated between a husband and wife, and it will take intentionality and time. I highly recommend premarital counseling for couples planning to be married and continuing counseling for the first year of marriage to work on behaviors that produce long-term marriages, such as realistic expectations, communication, flexibility, compromise, and commitment to stay for the long haul. Marriage was the Creator God's idea, and He stands by willing and able to help you keep the covenant you have made with each other, to stay the course. Don't hesitate to call on Him for help. I did mention, as I was going out for break, the whole subject of submission. So much is made out of this for women, that they are to be submissive to their husbands, and it is a biblical truth that is borne out in the church to Ephesus by Paul. And so in the book of Ephesians, the whole thing of submission is there for the woman. But I want you to understand that is a voluntary subjection. Not just being willing to submit with every command and demand that a husband makes in the marriage. And then I read at the end of that passage that husbands are to submit to their wives also. So there should be within a marriage, a good marriage, a submissiveness with and to each other. And I used as an example Abraham. When Abraham told, Sarah told Abraham to get Hagar and that son Ishmael out of their house, guess what Abraham did? He got Hagar and that son out of that house, and so he was being submissive to Sarah at that time. And so there is this mutual submissiveness, and that whole passage bears that out, that is to go on in a good and meaningful marriage. And then the last point that I want to make is that there are good and meaningful marriages. And when there's a good and meaningful marriage that has had to be worked on to get there, there's always love that endures, an enduring love. That doesn't go on just feelings alone. The agape love that I had mentioned previously is involved. It's unconditional love, the same love that God loves us with. There should be the agape love there. And then there is the phileo love in a good and meaningful marriage, and that's the love of friends, the love that friends have for each other and one another. And then the one that I mentioned, having to do with the sexual and the passionate, has to do with eros. And that also is something that needs to be tended to in the garden of marriage and love. And that is that to make sure that a couple makes sure that the sexual and passionate love needs are being met for each other. Again, Paul speaks to that, and he says this is to be true in a marriage, except when a couple chooses for a season to abstain for maybe spending some time only with the Lord, or fasting and praying and meditating and those kinds of things. But we're to make sure that as long as possible, physically and mentally, and especially physically and mentally, that the Eros love grows in our marriage garden of love also. And then when we think of good and meaningful marriages, there are certain needs that need to be met in a marriage that can make it more good and more meaningful. And within a good marriage should be companionship. I've seen couples that have that, and that is very needed in a marriage and in a marital relationship, that companionship. So many write us that are lonely when they've lost their mates, one way or the other, and especially in death. And the people that I speak with, the widows and the widowers, are usually very lonely people, having shared a good marriage and companionship with a husband or wife and so forth. So there should be companionship within a good and meaningful marriage. But here are 5 essential needs that we all have, whether in a marriage or out of a marriage, but they certainly are needed within a marriage. First of all, we have to think of the physiological needs. That has to do with housing, a place to live, clothes, food, what we would really refer to as the elementary needs in life. We all have those needs, and somebody is to make sure that those needs are met within the marriage. There are the security needs. One cannot be secure in a marriage when the mate is having an affair or is addicted to golf or addicted to this or addicted to that, and so forth. We must feel secure in a marriage and not always living on a day-to-day basis as to what's going to take place in this marriage today, and what decisions will I have to make today about my marriage. And there's what we call belongingness needs, which we do need in a marriage also. And that's true even in the community, that we need to belong to groups. We have a need to belong to groups and to our family and with our family. And we have this need in a marriage, the need to be loved and to belong and be significant to the other person in the marriage, that we belong together and that we belong, as it were, literally to each other. I'm not talking about a possessiveness within a marriage. I'm talking about a belongingness need. And then there are the esteem needs, as I've mentioned before, that we are to help our mates gather the self-esteem they need for their careers, for their jobs, and even in life and within the marriage. Some have very low self-esteems, and the other mate should see to it that these esteem needs are met within the marriage and can help build that mate's self-esteem. And finally, there are the growth needs. I mentioned change. Well, change can be good, and we should, if our change leads to growth, then it is going to be good for us in a marriage. So, and then we've mentioned the needs. We've mentioned there can be good and meaningful marriages, And so that's what I hope and pray as a result of this series, that you, if you're struggling in your marriage, that you can take some of these pointers that I've given you and end up having a good and meaningful marriage. And I'll tell you who can help you do that. And I've mentioned it before. God was the designer of marriage, and He is always there to hear, to listen, and to lend a hand, and to empower, and to enable you to make the changes that are necessary, either of you, to have a good and a meaningful marriage to enjoy till death do you part. And then I have some things to share from our viewers real quick before you go away. And the first one reads, Dear Dr. Freda, I have been angry at my husband for a long time. I am emotionally up and down, and he doesn't respond to me. He is very passive. We are both Christians, but I am considering separation as he is not an active partner in our relationship. Please pray for our marriage, which we have already done, and I would suggest seeking counsel for this kind of issue. And then the other one is, Dear Dr. Freda, I had not seen your program in a long time, and I was wondering if it was still on the air. I can't tell you how happy I was when, while channel surfing, I found the Time for Hope program. Thank God for you, your staff, and your guests, and we do the same. We thank God for all of our staff and our guests also. And then I suggest considering helping us financially with the expenses of this worldwide program. And then my next suggestion is that you join us again next week on Time for Hope.
A free fact sheet that contains additional information about today's topic is available upon request from our ministry. You can also receive a copy of today's resource for a donation of at least $3 to the Time for Hope ministry. Call us at 800-669-9133. Write us at Post Office Box 2169, Spartanburg, South Carolina 29304. Or visit our website at timeforhope.org. When you call or write, prayerfully consider a donation to our ministry. Our ministry's mission is to offer hope to discouraged and hurting people. As we continue to give out messages of hope, a financial gift of any amount to support this ministry will be greatly appreciated. When you do this, you are joining us in offering hope to many viewers seeking help and hope for their situation. This will also enable us to inform and inspire some viewers to expand our mission, as they learn and in turn can minister more effectively to hurting people around them. Until next time, have a great week. And remember, it is time for hope.